from the City of Victoria, Mayor Marianne Alto, by video conference. Madam Mayor, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much. Can you hear me okay?
Absolutely great.
Wonderful, thank you. It's a real privilege to be joining you this evening. I was in Ottawa earlier this morning, actually, and rushed back to my home to be able to join you. It's a real, as I say, a privilege to join you on this important topic. Thanks for the opportunity to contribute to this dialogue. I'm speaking with you here tonight from the traditional and contemporary lands and waters of the Lekwungen people, the nations of the Songhees and Esquimalt, on which the City of Victoria sits in its entirety. Tonight, I'll be speaking with you tonight on 4 ideas. First, the importance of a guaranteed basic income, which I'll periodically refer to as a GBI, how we might pay for a national program by transferring some program funds, the potential role of local governments in delivering a guaranteed basic income, and how a basic income affects community safety and well-being. First of all, a simple guaranteed basic income is just one component of a community's comprehensive economic, health, and social well-being. It's a manifestation of our collective compassion, of our commitment to treating and serving all of our residents with fairness and dignity. Canadians struggling to meet basic needs every day cannot fully participate in our society, and that is our loss. A guaranteed basic income creates opportunities for individuals with limited incomes to access and contribute to community programs and services from which they are otherwise barred because they lack financial capacity. So a GBI enables a greater degree of social and civic inclusion. Secondly, addressing income insecurity at a national scale at its source would save resources currently spent on reactive measures. For example, as the Senator previously mentioned, estimates have suggested that investments in a GBI could lead to an 8.5% reduction in emergency hospitalizations, which today could mean a savings of over $5 billion. Similar projections have been made for police, courts, and prison costs. I would argue that our society would be healthier and individuals could do their jobs better and thus be able to contribute to local economies through increased capacity to produce and purchase local goods. Recognizing the broad and local benefits of a national program, let me just turn for a minute to what my and other local governments might do on a smaller scale. So third, local governments are uniquely positioned to assess the need for and deliver a targeted GBI. We already plan and deliver services on which our residents rely, and such services are planned in response to ongoing assessment of local conditions like population demographics, housing availability and affordability, local cost of living realities, and all of the other life challenges that face all of our residents. Applying this same menu of assessment tools would allow local governments to tailor a GBI to the real residents in our communities in response to their real circumstances. To enable local governments to deliver local GBIs, all orders of government must engage in talks about a new fiscal framework that redistributes tax dollars to recognize the increasing share of responsibilities being embraced by local governments. But that is a conversation for another day. Fourth and finally, a GBI would have an enormous positive impact on our community's safety and well-being. Right now, Victoria is in the middle of a mayor's initiative reimagining how community safety and well-being is defined and what it is and can be in real practical terms. A significant aspect of our current community engagement is exposing my residents' anxiety about their financial security and their inability to respond to the rising costs of housing, food, healthcare, and the daily goods on which we all depend and which many of us take for granted. Those anxieties contribute to insecurities and fear, which play a demonstrable role in the breakdown of civil society, which undermines perceived and real community well-being and safety. When the city's community safety and well-being strategy is considered by our City Council in September, some model of a basic income will be a component. The potential impact on community well-being of a simple, easy-to-navigate guaranteed income program was inadvertently demonstrated after the COVID-19 pandemic, when the federal government implemented income support initiatives like CERB and wage subsidy measures, which resulted in notable drops in poverty-related statistics. It was also one of the most positively viewed government programs in recent years, and recent data compiled by the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternative noted that over 80% of recipients rated that program as thumbs up in a very positive way. Recipients described CERB as a source of stability and financial certainty when other parts of their lives were in chaos. It helped them deal with social and economic stress, care better for their loved ones, plan for adjusted or new employment, and allowed many to routinely take care of their basic needs. Adapting the best aspects of CERB to a GBI would help alleviate the damaging effects of poverty and facilitate access to financial security, improve health, employment, and education outcomes, and reduce stress levels. And as individuals' quality of life is improved by a GBI, so is the well-being of their and my and your communities. In conclusion, a GBI could provide just enough income to lift people gently out of poverty, reduce anxiety and fear, and increase the reality of and belief in local community well-being. Being sure that a person or a family's basic needs can be met means that these folk can take a moment to breathe and to think and to participate in community building because they don't need to spend every second of every day worrying about feeding their children or whether or not they can pay their rent. This makes our residents, my residents, your residents, full participants and contributors to all of our cities. I urge the Senate to facilitate the implementation of a national guaranteed basic income program through your support of Bill S-233, and until that is in place, to support local governments' forays into a provision of a similar program. Thank you.
So my question is, like, why is there such a lack of information there to support a basic income? Because there have been a number of pilots conducted over the years, or partial pilots, but there's no data there like that would support it compared to what was produced by Mr. Green out in British Columbia. So can you just speak to that? Would you be able to speak to that?
Just Senator Marshall, thank you for the question. Just a couple of quick things. I think the British Columbia report, which you cite, actually has to be situated in the context of the present government's priorities. There are so many incredibly dramatic and very aggressive priorities this government has put forward around housing and supports and a variety of other social services that this particular way forward has not been a priority for them. It is not likely to be on a provincial scale in the near future, partially because there is a provincial election looming, but also because there's been such an aggressive suite of other actions intended to be supportive of folks who are impoverished and struggling. But the second thing, I think, just on the data question, the pilots that have taken place here in British Columbia have accumulated data, though in a very short time. And what I would suggest also is that, as I mentioned in my remarks, the sort of inadvertent data that came forward as a result of the various income support programs that emerged out of COVID point dramatically to how those sometimes very minor assortments of different funding made incredible differences to people's capacity to be able to change the way they live when they were so close to being impoverished. So I think there are actually living examples within some of those programs that we would only need to accumulate with a little bit of effort to be able to provide exactly the data you need, which I completely agree needs to be accumulated.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
Yes, we can easily see that the gap is getting larger and larger between people who are in a fragile situation and those who have enough. So I know that everything is complex in the Federation, and given the shared responsibility between the federal and provincial governments in terms of tax credits and social, how can we ensure a guaranteed livable income in the context of the Canadian Federation?
Yeah, very briefly, I think that's an incredibly important puzzle for us to solve. There's no real way that we can do a national program until we have full consultation with all of the provinces and territories. But I would also urge the senators to consider the utility of including the municipalities as well, partially because we have the ability to actually do the work on the ground and provide you with some of the data and the examples that I think can be knitted together across the country to show all of the provinces and all of our leaders how it can get done.
Another question for Ms. Alto. Ms. Alto, I worked in the municipal field for 27 years. I was a mayor, so I understand your situation. So my great concern, it's a major issue in Quebec, is that currently municipal taxation relies on real estate tax. So for a long time, the municipality has been assuming a more important role on the social level. And that's where at the municipalities you have problems with homelessness and housing. In where you are, does that same thing exist, where the majority of your income comes from property taxes, which is deals with buildings and not people?
Thank you for the question. You're correct. The majority, more than 60% of our income as a municipality comes from property taxes. The rest comes from a variety of different agreements, services, and permits. So we do have a huge challenge, as I mentioned in my remarks, as we continue to take on more and more of what have been traditionally primarily provincial, but also some federal programs as well. We as a community here in Victoria, and I don't think we're alone, actually, certainly in British Columbia, have been for some years, as I'm sure is probably true across the country, somewhat reluctant and a bit angry, actually, at how much downloading, as we call it, has happened. But I think there's a real turn that is happening, and certainly my reference to our city's community safety and well-being plan is part of this. It's very much a realization that cities have now evolved and are evolving into much more compelling and much more directly service-oriented governance structures. And I think there's a real movement for us to, rather than resist that, actually to embrace it. And in that conversation, to then be able to look to our residents to say, you know, how much are you willing to spend in order for us to deliver these services to all of our residents, whether they're housed or unhoused, or whether they're impoverished or wealthy? They are all our residents, and we need to treat them with equity and with a certain degree, an absolute certain degree of fairness. That is what I referenced earlier about the more national conversation about having the degree of interaction around what is a new fiscal framework, but I have no illusions that that's coming soon. So when it happens in some years, I hope when I'm still in office, that's great. But meanwhile, we do have to take responsibility as municipal governors to find the money however we can in order to serve all of our people. If that's property taxes, then that's my responsibility as a mayor to persuade my residents that this is worth it, because I believe it is, and I believe they will too, with the proper information.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
There's no doubt that Canada, and I share what you said at the beginning, that at first sight, the introduction of a guaranteed minimal income would improve the situation, even though in Canada, if we compare ourselves to other countries, our neighbors especially, there's less of a gap between rich people and poor people. But from a study in 2021 by the Parliamentary Budget Officer, it seems it's not for certain that all categories would benefit from guaranteed basic income. For couples, it's fine, but a single parent with 2 children would actually find themselves in a worse off than they are currently because of the elimination of exemptions and the various tax credits that exist. And that situation varies from province to province. In some provinces, a single parent family with 2 children would lose a lot more than others. So my question is the following, and this is the PBO who was mentioning this. Do you agree with his conclusions? And how could we deal with this, given that the bill could be higher if we want no one to lose in a reform? My question is on incentives to work. The PBO and others say that this would have an effect on encouraging people to incentives to work when we have a strong, high immigration to compensate for our labor shortages. So to go ahead at a time when we have problems with labor, would that create a disincentive to work?
Can you add on 2 questions asked by Senator Gignac?
Just on the first one, actually, actually on both, but briefly on the first one, I think that the question that's posed that I'm not going to comment on the Parliamentary Budget Officer's piece. Obviously, that's beyond my purview. But I think that the notion that you are now considering a framework actually answers the question that was posed. Your framework has to be a living document. It has to be a document that is reflective of what the changes may be as society itself evolves. If you're going to create a framework, it can't be static. It can't assume that everything that we want to look at and consider right now is all that there will ever be. And so it has to be built in a way which allows there to be adaptability and evolution to be able to consider exactly the issues that I think are behind the question, insofar as being able to recognize that there will be different ways that different people actually respond to the concept of a basic income. And where there are situations where perhaps there is evidence that it's being overused or perhaps used inappropriately, there need to be consequences for that. But I agree with Senator Eggleton's comments in that I think we have a very strong work ethic in this country, and those issues would be the exception rather than the rule. So this, for me, is you're debating a framework that has to be evolutionary and living.
The COVID programs provided great relief for many Canadians. And I guess you could assume that if you had a parallel between the potential of these programs being implemented later on, you could use that as a basis to form another basic income program. So I'm just wondering, from that whole experience, what lessons have we learned?
And I agree with everything Senator Eggleton mentioned, but I think I'd like to approach it from a bit more crass perspective, and it's an example of numbers. The City of Victoria has spent over the last few years millions of dollars reacting to poverty-related crises in our cities is typical of most municipalities of any size at all. In fact, I think all municipalities. If we had actually been able to construct a relationship with the provincial government and other not-for-profit agencies to be able to create the supportive housing and supportive services that could have taken those people who are impoverished and placed them in a position where they could help themselves, we would have spent a lot less. And all you need to do is start looking at the actual cost of what municipalities and regions and provinces and the federal government are spending to support people in these fragmented policies and these fragmented programs, and compare the cost of that to something that's more cohesive and coordinated like you're discussing, you will, I believe, just on the numbers, even if you want to put aside the social responsibility aspect of this, the numbers themselves will speak in favor of this type of a framework.
My question, Mayor,
just
how do we get the various levels of government together?
On your second question about bringing governments together, I don't believe that there is a way for us to construct any type of a consistent national program unless the three orders of government are at the same table. Okay. And there's aspects of each one of those which can take control. Municipalities can do the direct work. Provincial governments can do the planning province by province, because each province has to be respected for its unique position. The federal government can be the backstop that says there are certain thresholds that you must meet. There are criteria that every program, no matter what it looks like, must meet, so that there's cohesion and there isn't a division amongst the different provinces and the different municipalities so that you choose one over the other because it's better. There has to be consistency. And I think the answer to your question lies right in front of you at your table. If you support this framework with the authority and persuasive capacity that all of you have, you can make this happen. And if you can lead on this, people like me can help you, because we can do it from the perspective of what we can do in city by city, what you can do on a national basis.
Thank you, Madam Mayor.
I wonder if you might give me your perspective. Those who participate in a guaranteed income program, do you believe that it would be a transitional program or a permanent program? And in order for it to be transitional, how could people be motivated or incentivized to no longer be on the program? Or would you see it as a permanent program for some?
Thank you, Senator Ross. I think that practically speaking, that there will always be a very small number of people who, for a variety of very legitimate reasons, can't move on. And that it's our responsibility as a community to ensure that those people are cared for adequately. But I think that Senator Eggleton is correct, that the vast majority of people would see this as being transitional, and there may be even a way to design the program where there are incentives for it to be transitional, and for there to be some limits on whether or not you can do it for an infinite period of time based upon different types of thresholds that are expectations. This is not to be a panacea, in my view. It's to be something which truly is transitional, to take folks who currently cannot get by or see anything further than the day-to-day struggles and crises, to give them that breathing room to be able to see the slightly bigger picture. And I believe when people can glimpse that and see the reality of it, they will move on. The Canadians are a very ambitious people. We have a history of that. And I don't think that's changed. So I think it is reasonable to think it's transitional, that there would be some incentives, but with the recognition that there are a few folks who just may not have the capacity to do more.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. And thank you again to both Mayor Alto and our former colleague, Senator Eggleton. I wanted to come back to the question that Senator Marshall raised about disincentives to work, because in fact when Professor Green was here and in their BC report, they talk about a basic income not having an appreciable negative impact on the workforce participation. As well, Dr. Jiaying Zhao, who testified, who's doing the cash transfers, is already documenting the very thing that Senator Ross also talked about, which is that by providing a lump sum payment, which is another model, it could be a model that would be incorporated or not, that they're seeing really quite quick results. Out of homelessness within 3 months, many of them employed within 12 months. Those are pretty amazing stats for data which we know in the social assistance system is quite the opposite. It keeps people entrenched in poverty and uses negative approaches and moralistic approaches rather than incentives to work, like the Ontario pilot. So I'm curious if either of you have more to add to that. And also, I know that when I first met you, Senator Eggleton, you weren't necessarily a supporter of basic income, and I think it might help some of the folks listening in the public, as well as some of my colleagues, to hear how you moved to that place of supporting basic income, because I know it wasn't always your view. And Mayor Alto, I'd like to hear how you came to this position as well.
Mayor Alto, comments, please, on the question from Senator Pate.
Thank you, Senator Pate, for that question. And if I heard it correctly, you were curious about how both Senator Eggleton and I came into this field. For me, it actually came from a different perspective, and it was working with a number of advocacy groups that had nothing to do with this particular topic, but had to do with a variety of different identified groups who themselves were oppressed for a variety of different reasons. And through those particular, in those sectors, the work that often had the most actually spectacular and almost immediate response was when those folks who had faced different types of discrimination for different issues unrelated to income were able to be supported even briefly with microlending or rent supplements or programs that allowed them to get a little bit of money that changed their ability to exist within whatever challenges they faced. And looking at the amazing benefit that even that very short term, and as Senator Eggleton described it, incremental type of assistance and the change it made in the ability to move people out of poverty, to move people into a place where they weren't as dramatically affected by the repression, it gave me that sense that if we could do this and have that kind of an impact in a short period of time, often with very small amounts of money, imagine what impact would happen if you could do that in a way which was organized and consistent and certain over a longer period of time, perhaps with a little bit more money. And so for me, it was very much the practical example of how much could happen with so little. And if you imagine that writ larger, what a huge impact that would have on folks who struggle day by day by day. And so that for me was the introduction over a dozen years ago now in trying to advance some interest in this type of a program nationally, provincially, and locally.
Do you believe we still have the fiscal capacity for such a policy today? Mayor, do you have any comments on that question?
I don't think we have any option but to proceed with something that will address what is going to be a much more urgent crisis as we move forward and examine the likelihood of increasing poverty across the country. From my perspective, as the crisis builds, it just dramatically means we have to do more. Secondarily, in the framework itself and in the questions around cost, I think we have to balance out. I agree completely. It has to be something we can afford. But when you start looking at the savings that we get, not just in healthcare, but in policing and emergency services and emergency responses, I think that you could, over a period of time, easily begin to look not at necessarily very much new money, but at the transfer and exchange of money from different programs in a more efficient way.
Senator, when you talked about institutionalizing poverty, that resonated for me. I'm a legal aid lawyer, and I ran for municipal office when I started representing the clients, the children of the clients that I had at the beginning of my practice. So there's this cycle where you don't break that cycle. It's just families living in this cycle. And so I guess my question is for Mayor Alto, because even though I sit here very honorably and happily as a senator, I do think the municipal level of government is often the most compelling. And so you said in your opening statement, and this speaks to what Senator Smith was talking about, the seeking of consensus, that if you could persuade your residents that this is the right thing to do. So what would you say to your residents how do you get that social consensus that is clearly lacking here? Because this has taken a long time. Pilots come and go, don't finish.
Yeah. Such an excellent question. Thank you so much for that. And I appreciate the background that you explained from how you got where you are. I think at a local level, at a local government level, there really is an unusual opportunity, as you imply, for us to be able to speak directly to our residents who, as you well know, and principally are the authors of all of the money that we get to do the services that we provide. In the context of the project that I described earlier, the Community Safety and Wellbeing Initiative that's ongoing right now in the city, part of that messaging as it begins to emerge is to be able to provide evidence that the folks who are the most colloquially hard done by are the same people of the folks who have something. People like me who have the privilege of owning a home need to see the individuals who don't as just as viable, just as legitimate, just as equal as any other Victorian from my perspective. And the stories we tell, the data that we have, we're collecting enormous amounts of data as we go through this project so that we can do, as some of your colleagues have asked earlier, we can actually provide the hard numbers that say, these many people will be served by this much money, and we expect, based on the evidence that we have, to have this much outcome. That has to be part of the persuasion. But it also has to be part of the storytelling that we do as well. And I understand that many people feel that that's not as valuable. But in the context of our work with our Indigenous partners, we understand more and more and more about how rich and important those stories are, because they're the stories of people. And if we can get the people who will be impacted by this to tell their own stories to the people who will ultimately pay for it, at least initially, then that coming together of people seeing one another's lives and how they can solve these problems together is so powerful that I believe the people who are paying up front, people like me, through our property taxes, will see the emergence of the people whose lives improve as they begin to be able to actually pay into the same system, as they move through it and become themselves perhaps more economically strong participants in our own community. It's a dialogue, it's a conversation, it's persuasion, yes it is, but it's based primarily on the combination of data, evidence, and the storytelling of people's lives as they change. We listen to one another. We like to listen to one another. If we can continue to keep that open mind, we will see the solution, because the solution is sitting next to us in the chair that's at the table, in the sidewalk where we're sitting on the bench, in the park where we're looking at the beautiful weather that we have here now. These are the people's stories that themselves provide the evidence that is persuasive. And that's what we're trying to do here with this project. And I believe it will work.
My first question is to Honorable Eglinton. I'm just wondering, from your experience working in government, from the municipal level to the federal level in many important roles, I'd like you to comment on what the development process set out in Bill 233 would involve, and what would it look like in practice to bring together all levels of government to develop a framework on guaranteed basic income. And I'm thinking of there's many different things like jurisdictional issues and navigating all those issues. Not all provinces get along well together, so there's many issues. So I'd like to get your comments on that.
Madam Mayor, do you have any comments on the questions from Senator McAdam?
Senator, thank you. I think you've hit a really critical question, and I think there's sort of two answers. What you're debating and considering the framework tonight is the mechanism. And so trying to figure out sort of the most general version of that, which allows the greatest flexibility with all orders of government, that's a challenging job, and I don't envy that for you. But once that mechanism is at least scoped in a general sense, I do agree with Senator Eglinton. It really is going to depend on your ability to persuade with your partners, including partners at the provincial and the federal and the municipal levels, to be able to buy into that mechanism, at least to start, and to be able to say, we need to try this. Here's one way forward. Let's try and activate this way forward. And as we move along, we'll make it better and we'll change it as we need to. But the first step, I think, is you deciding whether or not this framework is good enough for you to begin to imagine what that looks like. Because the mechanism part is easy. The next part will be getting everyone to the table to be able to at least begin to believe that there's a possibility of an outcome that works for everyone.
I'd like to sort of tag on to a lot of what's been said by the other senators.
But first of all, my observation has been over time that if you're looking at a program and wondering if it's going to be effective, two of the things you have to think about is it integrated and is it comprehensive? And so integration speaks to, in my mind, taking all the good things that are happening in each of the provinces and across the country, applying a bit of best practice, if you will, to some of that, and looking at, if I'm getting a job, I look at total compensation. I don't just look at sort of what money actually comes into my account, but there's other things. And I see those programs that are in the provinces now, with the help of the federal government very often, being part of that total compensation. For instance, if I'm a single mother and I need a basic income, absolutely. I also need quality childcare in order to be able to do my job and to be able to look to the future of a better career, if you will. That's just an example. Also, to the point of data, there have been things done around the housing first philosophy. And we do know that savings are being made there, and there's data to support that. The City of Calgary did a wonderful job of keeping data on their Housing First project and the decrease in the number of emergency visits, the decrease in policing costs, the decrease in brushes with the justice system, if you will. And our little city of Fredericton actually replicated that study in a very small project, but they looked at how many people, the people that were in that Housing First program and were supported in their housing, and you spoke to that at first, how over a year, drastic decreases in the number of visits to the emergency room and so on and so forth. So I think what I'd like to ask both of you is, you talk about this, it being, the framework being a living framework. I think that was you,
Yes.
Mayor Alto. And so I'd like your comments on, this is a framework, and in fact in the bill itself it speaks to the other services that will be necessary. So how do we produce something that's not just a check in the mail, but is an integration of a package of programs or a basket of programs that makes a comprehensive support for people that are living in poverty?
Thank you for that question. Really a critically important one, because I think that we've talked about the framework being something that is supplementary, not in place of. But at the same time, it has to be complementary as well. And so it is going to take some time. If the framework is pursued, and I certainly hope it will be, it is going to take some time to be able to bring together what many of you have referred to before as all the orders of government in some fashion, to be able to say, in British Columbia, for example, and I loved your example of Fredericton, we did something similar in Victoria. In British Columbia, these programs exist and they work pretty well. And this is how we know that. Here's all the data. Now, what's missing maybe for a particular cohort of individuals is this particular income supplement. How do we make sure that in providing that, however that looks, it doesn't detract from all of these other programs on which these people rely for a variety of different things? So there has to be a model for some complementary version of integration that isn't instead of, but is in fact an addition to. Is it going to be easy? Absolutely not. And I don't think anyone is foolish enough to suggest that it is. But it's essential because it can fill those gaps. And it's the gaps themselves that are sort of keeping people right on the edge of not being able to advance their careers, their families, their future. With this little nudge of this potential additional piece, you will complement all of those other programs that you've described in your own community and exist in mine as well, that allow there to be that holistic picture for the single mom with a couple of kids, for the family who has had two breadwinners, both of whom have been laid off for some reason, or all of the other things that we can imagine. It has to go back to something I said earlier. It's concentrated, it's organized, it's complementary, and it's based on what individuals need. Again, not easy. Is that old expression my late mother would say, nothing good ever is. But it's absolutely essential. And so your question, to a certain extent, challenges us to find that way forward, which includes as many governors, many different orders of government as possible, at the same time, not forgetting we're trying to figure out how best to serve people.